because this is more journeying and traveling and walking rather than reading. In my opinion, in my experience, this is almost literally like making a journey. Hello and welcome back. Canto 31 of Paradiso is very different from Canto 30, even if it's still part of this narrative block that goes from Canto 30 to 33. They are really a unitary element, and it's very different because while in Canto 30 we had all of Dante's surprise and amazement in front of all these new images and things, that not only things and images but also his new sight. He finally has the superpowers, the super sight, and he can see everything clearly now. Here in Canto 31, a little bit like it happened when he arrived in the Garden of Eden, where first he was surprised, but then he had some time to walk around and just take it all in, enjoy, almost like a nice peaceful stroll around. This is the feeling that this canto gives us, because it's very peaceful, but at the same time it's also extremely emotional canto, at least for Dante, and it contains what I find some of the really most moving parts of the Divine Comedy. Maybe this is the second most moving part in the Divine Comedy, in my opinion, after the prayer to Mary in Canto 33. And of course I'm referring to the farewell to Beatrice, and so specifically to verses from 79 to verse 90. Those verses, I don't know many people who read the entire comedy, enjoy it very much, and get to these verses and are not at least a little bit moved. I am very moved every time I read them. But outside of that particular core of the canto, everything else is pure brightness, whiteness, because there's a lot of white, light, and peace. So in the beginning, when we start reading the canto, Dante is telling us there is the Saint Militia. It's always interesting how he's using martial terms when it comes to the different roles of heaven, the angels, the blessed souls. So in the first tercet is referring to the blessed souls, the human blessed souls. The second tercet is referring to angels, and he's comparing angels to a swarm of bees that, just like bees, they are buzzing around the celestial rose, and they are taking, like Dante says, they are taking the peace and ardor of God down to the blessed souls, and then they go back. So it's almost a cycle. I'm reading from verse 16. Quando scendean nel fior, di banco in banco, porgevano della pace e dell'ardore, che li acquistavan ventilando il fianco. So this peace and ardor seem to be really at the center of the emotions and sentiments and feelings that everybody, including Dante, has in this place, in the Empyreum, where we are, the 10th heaven. Peace and ardor remind us of contemplation, because that's what you do in heaven. You enjoy, you contemplate, or like my friend Jason said, you just be yourself under the gaze of God. And in that state of being, there is blessedness, there is obviously happiness. If the Divine Comedy is an entire spiritual direction in order to achieve happiness, this is the happiness that Dante has been able to find in his life, and that Christian theologians are speaking about, that the Christian church is speaking about. Of course, Dante is doing what he can to describe something that is indescribable. But he has already told us it's ineffable, indescribable, but I'm going to describe it to you anyway. So at verse 28, there is a beautiful celebration of the Trinity. Again, one of the two main mysteries that Dante wants to articulate and understand with Paradiso. And then at verse 31, he begins with one of two similes. He basically is making like a double simile to describe himself in front of the spectacle of the Empyreum. And the first one is very curious because he brings in the scene the barbarians. Sei barbari, venendo da tal plaga che ciascun giorno d'elice si cuopra, rotante col suo figlio ondella e vaca. This is yet another classical allusion to the myth of Helice. Although many people know her as Callisto, she was seduced by Jupiter, and as Jupiter would do, he was a terrible, horrible, horny god, and she was turned into a bear by Juno as revenge against for jealousy. So her son, the son that she had with Jupiter, saw her during a hunting party, but as soon as the son was going to kill her, because he just thought it was a simple bear, Jupiter intervened, and maybe for compassion, who knows, he transformed them both into constellations. She became the Great Bear, the constellation of the Great Bear, and he, the son, became the Little Bear. These two constellations are visible all year round from Northern Europe. So, circumlocution for Dante to say Northern Europe, where the barbarians would come from. And this barbarian is coming to Rome. I love this simile because Dante is creating almost a sub-narrative, a miniature story of this barbarian arriving to Rome and seeing all the magnificence of the city. He mentions Laterano. It was the Lateran Palace where all the first emperors were based, and then the popes later on. But it's one example of the myriads of beauties and things that he could not even have imagined. This little barbarian, hairy and dirty barbarian. So what strikes me about the simile is that the moral comparison between the barbarian and the environment of Rome is maybe not the first one that he thought about. He is thinking about something of a evolution in terms of civilization, of the degree of civilization that a Roman citizen would have in those times compared to a barbarian. And because Dante is always thinking about politics, this is the reason why politics was so important for him and close to his heart, because it was about the ability for human beings to come together, to live together well. It was impossible to do it without elevating ourselves from themselves, human beings, to the best versions of themselves, the most civilized versions of themselves. The second simile is maybe a little bit less striking, but still strong and very much in line with the rest of the canto. He compares himself to a pilgrim in the temple he has vowed to reach. And this pilgrim is renewing himself. He looks and hopes he can describe what it was like. The entire canto, I have to say, if we compare it with the majority of the Paradiso cantos, is a very readable one, because in the intentions of the author, this is all really about contemplation, love, and his love and gratitude for Beatrice, of course. What is this pilgrim in the temple doing? He is looking around and he's hoping that he can describe what it's like in the temple, so that maybe in the future day, week or month, he has the ability to describe what he's seen to family, friends, etc., which is something that we have completely lost today thanks to phones and iPhones. For sure, we should be grateful that Dante did not have an iPhone in Paradiso with him, and he had to remember and write things down instead of just taking pictures and posting them on Instagram. That would not have been as good as having the Divine Comedy for us. Now, everything is calm and peaceful and joyful. Dante looks around. At some point, he thinks about Beatrice. He wants to address her again, ask some questions. His curiosity has been satisfied about his main questions, but his curiosity is really endless. So he turns around per domandar la mia donna di cose di che la mente mia era sospesa. Uno intendea e altro mi rispose. One thing was who I meant to speak to, but something else was the person who replied to me. Un sene Sene comes from, it's a Latinism and means an old person, an old guy, an old man. I saw an old guy, credea veder Beatrice, e vidi un sene, vestito con le genti gloriose. So just like the moment when he realized that Virgil had disappeared, Dante immediately, Dante the Pilgrim is such an impulsive and extroverted character, he almost screams, he says, Ovella, where is she? And this old man, replies that all of your longings may be satisfied. Beatrice, urge me from my place. Now you look up and at the highest rank, and you will see her on the throne that her merits have assigned her. So Beatrice has gone back to the place that belongs to her in heaven. And io vidi lei che si facea corona riflettendo da sé gli eterni rai. So there is no space and time here in Empyreum, so it doesn't matter that the place where Beatrice's throne is impossibly distant from Dante. Dante can still see her very well, because it's a spiritual concept, and her sanctity is shining around her, almost like an aura, almost like a halo, I would say, but it's forming a crown of light around Beatrice. And now here we are. This is Dante's heart. He is gifting his heart to this poem, because it's like opening his heart and looking in. It's so moving, and it's so high as a poetry, because immediately by reading these lines between 79 and 90, you realize that you know that Dante is talking about something very personal. You know that he is being very intimate and specific, but you also realize that it's about you. It's about me. It's about you. It's about something that we all know very well, something that we all feel. It doesn't matter if it's not necessarily a woman, but a person, somebody that we are so grateful that this person existed, that this person came in contact with us, with our life. And Dante is expressing this here in the best possible way that I can imagine. I will try to read it slowly in Italian. O donna, in cui la mia speranza vige, e che soffristi per la mia salute in inferno lasciar le tue vestigie, di tante cose quant'io ho vedute, dal tuo podere e dalla tua bontate, riconosco la grazia e la virtute. Tu m'hai di servo tratto a libertate, per tutte quelle vie, per tutti i modi che di ciò fare avei la potestate. La tua magnificenza in me custodi, sì che l'anima mia, che fatta è sana, piacente dal corpo si disnodi. And these are unbelievable lines, unbelievable lines. Note something. Dante, for the first time, is speaking to Beatrice with the tu, which is the confidential and affectionate way to speak to somebody, as opposed to the honor-driven or honorificent voi, which is in the second plural, that he has been speaking to her in the rest of Paradiso. This is a mini poem within the poem that has so much beauty in it. And what happens now? Così orai, e quella, sì lontana come parea, sorrise e riguardòmi. She smiled at him, and for the very first time, Dante is able to sustain that smile. For the very, very first time, in fact, it's the second time, because we remember in La Vita Nuova, in the New Life, that Dante described that famous smile that made something burst inside of him when they were crossing, when he crossed her on the street, and she smiled at him, specifically at him, and he ran home and he had a lot of visions, probably an epileptic fit or something else. But he is stating here that finally he has the strength. He finally had not only the strength, but he is feeling like he finally deserves to be able to see that smile again. In a certain sense, here Dante is also closing the circle. He's closing the circle with the very beginning of the love story with Beatrice. Now, whatever is left is going to be more about God, more about Christ and Christianity than about Beatrice. The immense love story that he's been narrating to us, in a certain sense, ends here. But where does Beatrice's strength and Beatrice's beauty come from? That's where Dante is going now. Then the old man introduces himself as in line 102, he says, La Regina del Cielo, the Queen of the Sky, who is Mary, the Virgin Mary, La Regina del Cielo, ond'io arto tutto d'amor, ne farà ogni grazia, perch'io sono il suo fedel Bernardo. He is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He is from Burgundy, from the Burgundy region in France. Saint Bernard was a monk and somebody who was very important in the period where he lived, which was the 11th century. He had a special devotion to Mary, and he, in fact, it's thanks to him if Mary had a revitalization of her devotion within Christianity. One of the biggest stereotypes within and outside Christianity is that Christians, in fact, worship Mary. That is not the fact. Mary is an intercessor. There is a devotion to Mary. There is not worship of Mary. God and Christ are worshipped, but not Mary. The choice of Saint Bernard by Dante is seems to be a perfect one to be his last final guide for this brief final tract of Paradiso, for three main reasons. The first one is, in fact, his devotion, particular devotion to Mary. Dante was also very devoted to Mary, and he wanted to find somebody like a saint or a father of the church with that characteristic. Dante was, in my opinion, also already gearing up for that masterwork of poetry that is the prayer to Mary in Canto 33. So he needed somebody whose qualities would explain the ability to pray, to elevate a prayer to Mary that's so beautiful. And in fact, Saint Bernard was also known in antiquity as Doctor Mellifluous. So this is the name that the church has given to him, and this Doctor Mellifluous means the doctor who was very smooth with his words. So he had a reputation for his great eloquence, and this is the second reason why Dante chose him, because the level of his eloquence was really high. And third reason is because Saint Bernard was also a mystic. He was a contemplative. He gave a lot of strength to the Benedictine movement during his life. He was also involved in politics, in church politics, and so he was an important figure, an important character. But at the same time, he, especially in the latter part of his life, I would love to read a life of Saint Bernard at some point in my life. In the latter part of his life, he ended up refusing to take on some very high political and powerful role that was offered to him by the church, because he preferred a life of contemplation and a life of a mystic. So, third reason why Dante chooses him is his contemplative mysticism. At verse 103, it's interesting that Dante mentions Croatia. He says, Qual è colui che forse di Croazia viene a vedere la Veronica nostra, che per l'antica fame non sensazia. Mentioning Croatia in Dante's times was almost like in our times to mention Timbuktu. In fact, probably not our times, but 50 years ago, if you mention Timbuktu, that was the same thing. Today, there's no place that we, aside from the moon maybe, or Mars, that we actually consider very, very distant. And so that's why Dante says Croatia. Viene a vedere la Veronica. The Veronica is one of the greatest relics of Christianity. It was, back in Dante's times, conserved in St. Peter's Church. And it is this piece of tissue that, according to the Gospel, a woman gave to Jesus on his way to the Calvary, and that Jesus used to clean his face, or at least dry it, and so the shape of his face remained on the piece of tissue. And the interesting thing about the mention of this relic is that this is a clear prelude to Canto 33. In fact, to the very end of Canto 33, where Dante will see an effigy of Christ and an effigy maybe of even himself while he's looking into God, into the divine. But we're gonna get there. And then notice how, in referring to Saint Bernard, Dante says, Talera io mirando, at line 109, Talera io mirando la vivace carità, which means the living love. Instead of, he doesn't say, I was looking at his face. He doesn't give corporality to it. He says la vivace carità, the love. So he really is keeping it a little indeterminate on purpose. And the same technique he will use at verse 133, 134, and 135, where he actually looks at the Virgin Mary for the first time. Very, very beautiful verses here. They're just so lovely. 133. Vidi a lor giochi quivi e a lor canti ridere una bellezza che Letizia era negli occhi a tutti gli altri santi. Una bellezza means a beauty, a loveliness. And this purposely vague tone that he's using is used to try to detach from anything that might sound or look corporeal. The moment when Saint Bernard guides Dante's gaze towards Mary is beautifully slowed down by Dante. There is almost, in fact, a true slow motion action here between 121 and 133, line 121 and line 133. A slow motion sun rising as if of dawn. That's the simile that Dante is using. E come quivi ove s'aspetta il temo che mal guidò Fetonte. The chariot that Fetonte brought in a very bad way, that's the sun. So he is referring to the sun in that moment where it's slowly rising and all the other lights, and it's overwhelming all the other lights. There is this very interesting term at 127, which is Aurea Fiamma. It's incredibly translated by Mandelbaum as Oriflamme. I'll be very curious to hear what other translators do with that, because it's such a very specific word that indicated the royal standard of France in Dante's times, which was red, made of red silk, and it was their standard, their banner of the French. So that's what he's comparing. That's the term that Dante is using to talk about the sun as a simile for the beauty of Mary that is shining even harder and brighter than all the other lights around her. I also love the final tercet where Dante says Bernardo come vide gli occhi miei nel caldo suo caler fissi attenti. Here we have a mini explanation of what great friendship is and what great friendship can be. When you love something with all your soul and all your heart, and the other person, another person, loves the same thing with the same level of intensity and with their entire heart, that is friendship. They kind of look at each other, Dante and Bernard, and they feel a commonality. They feel really close to each other because of the great love they have for Mary. My final comment is it has to be, I think, on the importance of the female side of reality. I think this is what really we can extrapolate from Canto 31. We have Beatrice and we have Mary, and they are the true protagonists of the Divine Comedy. They are the true generators of this entire long journey that Dante made 700 years ago, and that we can make, because this is more journeying and traveling and walking rather than reading. In my opinion, in my experience, this is almost literally like making a journey. And Dante is telling us here, I'm going towards God, but I wouldn't have been able to do any of this if it wasn't for two female characters. One is almost purely spiritual, and that's Mary, that I pray to every day. And the other one is Beatrice. Dante knew the power, the strength of the feminine elements of reality. We know them too. I know them too. There is the type of gratitude that Dante is expressing in his mini poem to Beatrice here in this canto says something about Beatrice that takes us back to the end of Purgatorio. Because do you remember how disappointed she was in him? How he had betrayed her? It doesn't matter how and with what or with whom, but she knew that he had betrayed her. Now, after Dante had betrayed her, Beatrice still had so much love in her that she had the strength and the courage to go down to Limbo, to go down to Inferno, and save Dante in order to bring him to this freedom, which is beautiful. He was a slave and now he's free. Mary, in herself, yes, she was the mother of God, she was the mother of Jesus, but from the spiritual point of view, she also is representing all the love of all the mothers of the world, of history. Just try to imagine how great the love of a mother is, and multiply it by all the mothers of history and symbolize it with one person. Now we're talking about something that it couldn't be more real. We're not talking about fairies, we're talking about something that is in fact a very real reality. But Dante and Bernard will have a great chance to express all their love to Mary very shortly in Canto 33. For now, see you soon with Canto 32. Thank you so much for watching.